And we'll talk about why. But you remember that, you saw the picture, it's pretty creepy. You watched the video, right? Right? Okay. So let's talk about artificial selection. So artificial selection, we talked about it before, when people turned a wild mustard plant into broccoli, when people turned a normal cow into the ginormous Belgian blue. All of that was, you take existing variation, which is caused by different alleles, different versions of a gene. How do we get the different versions of a gene? I'm looking for a damn word. Mutations, yeah. Okay, and then selective pressure, the people deciding who gets to breed, who doesn't. Wow, that cow bulked up fast. Let's have it have lots of babies. That's what we want. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so if you've ever been to Disney and you ride on the monorail, you go past topiaries. Funky looking bushes. They're, oh, a bush that looks like an elephant. What happens is that's an ordinary bush. The bush grows. The bush has branches. And sometimes a branch will grow on this side, sometimes it'll grow there, sometimes it'll grow there, sometimes it'll grow up here. And then along comes a guy with pruning shears. Yeah, you help it look like an elephant. We'll leave you alone. No, you don't make this look like an elephant. Snap! And you take that branch off, right? That's what's happening with artificial selection. You have funny looking dogs and you're breeding them, and I want a dog with a curly tail. Oh, you have a curly tail? Yes, you can breed. Oh, you don't have a curly tail? Yeah, you get castrated. Eventually, you'll get a bush that looks like an elephant. Eventually, you'll get a dog that looks like you want it to look. By allowing some things to grow and thrive, allowing other things to not. Okay, they don't contribute to the population anymore because you don't let them. People are controlling it. Are we good? Is that making sense? All right, so here's our famous slide from the last, I told you you'd see it again, I wasn't lying. Here is our slide that we saw in the last PowerPoint. You have a wild mustard plant, and through natural selection, we've turned it into broccoli and into disgusting. It is easy to do, right? Just takes a lot of time. You decide what gets to breed and what doesn't. And I obviously wasn't involved because turnips exist. Here we have foxes. Aren't they adorable? Yes. What you're seeing here is the Russian fox breeding experiment. Here's the deal. We turned foxes to be dog-like through artificial selection. We made wolves into dogs through artificial selection. Here's a wolf, and here are all the different dog breeds, right? What Eric Hare, the anthropologist in that video, talked about, he said that at first they were just selecting for non-aggression, and they end up with a general dog that had some general dog traits. After that, we then use artificial selection intensively to say, I want a dog that can run with really short legs so it can run at full speed down a badger hole to hunt. You do realize dachshunds were originally hunting dogs. That's the whole point. Okay, dash hound. It dashes down a badger hole, dashes down a rabbit hole. Oh, and my God, if we're going to hunt rabbits, wouldn't it be good if, like, you could easily, ears up. Oh yeah, I'll shoot my 20 gauge. Ears down. No, I won't. So floppy ears are a good thing. That's what we're going to select for. Here, you select for one that is really good at keeping sheep in one area, really good at herding stuff. Okay? Here, you select for one that's really good at hunting rats. That's what you're doing. Okay? Here, you select for one that's extremely loyal and will follow you into anything, including a dang fire. And it will lead your butt out if you get lost in the building. So we used artificial selection to make all kinds of dogs. If you breed for something that can smell really well, you've got a bloodhound. If you breed for something that is all like absolute level badassery, you get a great peer.
You can fight wolves, right? Something like that.
Screw wolves, you hunt bear. Not hunt bear, you fight bear. You keep the bear away from your sheep. Yeah. This one was pretty torn up. You can see he's real bloody, his eyes messed up.
He fought somebody.
He killed 3 wolves.
No.
He took a pack of wolves himself.
No.
So let's talk about this. This is a Saluki. A Saluki is pretty dang fast. Okay? Dogs have random variations. Some of them are a little faster than others. Okay? People in the Middle East who hunted gazelles wanted a dog that could run down gazelles and bring them back around so they could take a shot with their bow and arrow and kill them. So what do? They bred the fastest dogs, were the best hunters, right? They didn't breed the other ones, and guess what? they ended up with really long legs and really thin, tiny, streamlined heads, and even a tucked waist that allows the front legs to come up higher. You see that shape? That is the shape of an animal that is fast. So what happens? You breed the fast dogs, and if you happen to get a slow one, well, you sell that to your brother-in-law. You keep the fast ones and you keep breeding. I'm just saying. You keep the fast ones
I got it.
and you breed those.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Eventually, the whole population of dogs that you have are going to look kind of like that.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about a Cape hunting dog. What do we see here? We see
Everything.
long legs. We see a tucked waist.
Everything.
All right. This is not something that was shaped by people. This is shaped by the fact that it hunts gazelles for a living. It does the same thing. Now we'll get to that. So here's the way it worked. They're out in nature. There's random variation. There's some that are fast. There's some that are slow. There's some that are good at killing, some that are not good at killing. If you're good at running down gazelles and killing them, you eat well. And if you don't, you starve. And you can't make milk to support your babies, and you die, or your babies die. They don't have as much success breeding. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So over time, natural selection, working just like artificial selection, causes the population to get the long legs, to get the tucked waist. Not get captured by the predator easier, but you don't get to have any babies. You get that you were just selected against. It is more important to, the way nature keeps score, I've said this before, I'm going to say it again, you'll hear it again. The way nature keeps score is by who leaves the most babies.
Of course.
That's who wins, the one who leaves the most babies. All right? So right here, look at this. These things have a similar lifestyle. They both hunt gazelle. They have similar appearance. Would you agree they both got the long legs?
Yes.
Would you agree they both got the tucked waist?
Okay.
So artificial selection, characteristics that people choose become more common in that population because we choose what gets to breed. Natural selection, characteristics that let you survive and breed become more common because you're the one breeding. Make sense? Make sense? All right, so they both get the long legs, the tucked waist. That's the way it is. Okay, so we get to talk about Chuck. We get to talk about Darwin. Oh, so we got to talk about Darwin. All right. Here's young Darwin. Here's old Darwin. In between the two, he spent a heck of a lot of time messing around with pigeons. You can probably tell. Okay. This book has a lot of stuff on pigeons. When I was in grad school, we had to read the whole book. I have a confession. There were some parts about pigeons that I skipped. I got really sick of hearing about the pigeons. Young Darwin came up with the idea of natural selection. And then he sat on that idea and did nothing with it. Well, I shouldn't say that. He sat on that idea and didn't publish because he knew it would get people riled up. He said, I've got to support this really, really carefully. My family's established, they have a good name, we're upper class people. I don't want to drag my family's name through the mud. If I'm going to say something's going to rile people up, I better have some evidence. He spends 20 flipping years, 20 years screwing around with pigeons, gathering evidence. This is him towards the end of his life. That's when he got around to publishing this. Okay, so he's gathering evidence. And a lot of the time he spent breeding pigeons and hanging out with people who bred pigeons, people who bred dogs. Artificial selection was going on, where people are making different breeds of pigeons. But let's not talk about Darwin, let's talk about someone more fun. All right, so what I like to call this is the somebody would have figured it out principle. Here we got Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin. You know that one already, we've talked about that one. They're both working on DNA. If these guys hadn't gotten it, she sure as heck would have. How do we know that? Because they stole her photo to get it. I shouldn't say stole it. They sneaked a peek at it. Okay, here we have Hardy and Weinberg. They're two biologists who came up with the exact same mathematical formula to describe when natural selection happens and when it doesn't. They were not working together, okay? Here, these guys you know. De Vries, Correns, Mendel. This guy, he discovered something really important, and now father of genetics, but it was irrelevant. If these guys hadn't discovered all the same stuff, we wouldn't even know it. All right? And here, I talked about these guys in the beginning of the thing. This is Frank Whittle, this is Hans von Ohain. Brit, Nazi, World War II. Not working together on the design of the jet engine, but both designing jet engines for airplanes. First, a few months behind, his engine kept blowing up, theirs didn't. That's why the Germans had the first production jet fighter. But they were both working on jet fighters. Time and time again, when you get to this level in knowledge, the next step becomes apparent to anybody who's paying attention. Darwin, if he had never published, wouldn't matter because Wallace had all the same ideas. The difference is that Darwin was upper crust, and Darwin wanted to protect his family name and make sure he had a ton of evidence. Wallace was young and hungry and from a lower class and trying to do social climbing, and he wanted to make a name for himself. He wasn't afraid to say something controversial. So where Darwin had 250 pages of notes but wasn't ready to publish the book, he wrote down in 20 pages, racked with malaria, writes down in 20 pages, this is how natural selection happens, and sends it off. All right? But it's the somebody would have figured it out principle. I get sick of people, well, Darwin said, I don't care what Darwin said. Because Wallace found all the same stuff. Because natural selection, the idea stands alone, and if he wasn't involved, Wallace would have said all the same things. How do we know? Because he did! Remember, Darwin actually tells Lyell, my God, it's like he's been reading my notes. Okay, so natural selection. Let's talk about the historical context. This is something that a lot of people don't think about. So you know how I give you a list and then we go over each thing in the list in detail. That's basically what we're doing. So we're going to talk about what previous scientists had written, what people were doing in the Victorian era as a hobby, as a pastime, and then we're going to talk about the books people were reading. And the key thing I want you to take home, that's why I put this in boldface and in red, is just like now, people are culturally aware of things, of what's going on in their society. And the same thing was true then. And that has a lot to do with why Darwin and Wallace came up with the same idea. They were alive at the same time. Darwin was a lot older than Wallace, but they were alive at the same time. They're both interested in the same thing. They know what's going on. Are you with me? All right, so let's go over these a little bit. Here's Erasmus Darwin. That's Chuck's grandpa. The important thing is that everybody says Darwin came up with evolution. No, he didn't. If you get nothing else out of this chapter, no, he didn't. He came up with a mechanism to explain it. Other people had been saying that things changed over time, that species now were not the same as species before. Other people had been saying that in his own family for a long time. Now, it was not a majority opinion. It was oh, that's interesting, you're educated. It's kind of a fringy thing to believe that. Darwin said, oh yeah, that thing other people have been saying that you thought was fringy, it's not, here's the reason why. That's what Darwin did.
So he's just the one who spent 20 years of his life gathering the evidence?
Yes, exactly. He came up with the evidence that his method, Wallace's method as well, natural selection was what's happening. I know this sounds weird to you guys, but what I said here, this slide, evolution was not the thing that was controversial in Darwin's day. The idea that things are not the same, they used to believe everything was fixed in time, and this species is the way it is the way it is the way it is, and it doesn't change in nature. They knew that everybody was breeding dogs and changing their shape, but the idea that species change in nature the same way, that was the controversial thing that pissed everybody off. I'm not kidding you, I know. Here's something, if you get nothing else out of the class, get this. Darwin did not come up with the theory of evolution. Everyone says he did. He did not. People had been believing this before him. It was just not a popular view. It wasn't supported. People didn't know how it happened. People thought it was happening. There were a few people. And one of them was his grandpa. His grandpa in 1796. Now remember, Darwin wrote this in 1859. In 1796, Grandpa Darwin, Erasmus, He wrote a book called Zoonomia, and in it he said, you know, many current species may have descended from a single ancestor. No, he didn't have anything to back it up. It was just him thinking. But this is what he actually said. Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind, by the way, that age of the earth thing, it wasn't controversial back in the day. Everybody bought that. That wasn't the thing that was controversial at all. It's a modern thing to, oh, Earth is 6,000 years old. That's a very modern view. Anyway, since the commencement of the history of mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament, meaning one living thing, which the great first cause, that's how he wrote God, endued with animality, turned into an animal, with the power of acquiring new parts and attending to new propensities, directed by the irritations, sensations, volitions, and associations, thus possessing the faculty of continuing to improve on its inherent activity, blah, 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 blah. He clearly was saying everything could have come from one living thing, and then it changed over time. Would you agree? And he wrote this back in 1796, a long time before Darwin. All right, here's a guy who in the 1820s, he was writing, and I think it was 1820, but anyway, Lamarck was writing, and he said, you know, descent with modification. Yeah, that's it. That, by the way, that's what they called evolution at the time. Nobody called it evolution. The term hadn't been invented yet. Everybody called it descent with modification. But he said descent with modification, it's happening. Yeah, it's totally happening. And I have a mechanism. I can explain how. Well, he couldn't. He was wrong. But he came up with, so it wasn't just, see, back then people were saying, I think this is happening. By the 20s, people were saying, I think this is happening, and I think this is why. Now, they weren't right about the why. But people were talking about this idea. It wasn't like it was out there. And you can see, it wasn't just Darwin's family. This is some dude over in France, not some guy in Britain, right? Right? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Lamarck's idea. And basketball. Wake up, children. We're going to talk about the basketball. All right. So here we go. Here, imagine we have two giraffe type looking things. All right? And one of them eats bushes and eats bushes and eats bushes, whatever. And it has kids that eat bushes. But another one decides they don't want to eat trees. And so it stretches on its tippy toes and it stretches its neck as high as it can go so it can eat off the tree. And over time, because it's been stretching, its neck gets longer, its legs get longer. Okay, great. And then it has a baby. And the baby's going to be tall just like the dad, because the dad stretched and grew longer. This was Lamarck's idea. We don't believe this. We think he's wrong. And I'll explain why in a second. You'll be like, well, duh. And so Lamarck says, so in this generation, they'd be this tall, and this, they'd be this tall, and this tall. They get taller over time until they can eat off taller and taller trees. It's a nice sounding idea. Here's the problem with it. Sheldon, you said you might be able to help me learn basketball.
Yeah.
You think you could help me learn it well enough that at my age I could train you into the NBA? No. I agree with you. I might be able to slim down, might be able to lose a little weight, probably should. Might be able to get a little healthier. I'm not going to be able to play in the NBA. It's just not going to happen. All right? Just because I try and change my body a little, there are limits to the amount of change you can have, right? I'm not going to get tall like you. I'm not going to be able to jump as high as you. I'm not going to be able to play. That's it. It's just the way it is. It's sad. It's the way it is. All right. Let's take it one further. Does anybody in the room know somebody who works out a lot? He's really cut. He's really buff. You know what I'm talking about? They have a kid. That kid come out with a six-pack? No? Wait, but dad worked out and shaped his body? You're meaning it's not passed on to the kids? You're not surprised by this? You mean like you kind of expect the kid to not have a six-pack? Wow, Lamarck was wrong. Let's move on. Okay? But it was an idea. It just wasn't the right idea. All right. That was the 1820s. Now we're up to the 1840s. Now this will be kind of interesting because you'll see Darwin in the 1830s came up with his idea, but he didn't publish. Nobody was talking about it. So, but we'll get to that in a second. But the thing is, in the 1840s, this guy, his name was Robert Chambers. He was a journalist. He also dabbled in geology, wrote a few geology books. He wrote a book called The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Of course, he was sort of chicken. He published it anonymously, wouldn't put his name on it, because he knew it would rile people up. We'll talk about it in a second. What he said was that there was progressive transmutation of species. Fancy way of saying, the species here in the past that we're digging up in the rocks, the fossils, they're not the same as the ones we have now. Things are different, they've changed. Well, to us, we're like, yeah, duh. But back then, that was a big deal. That was controversial. The reason it was controversial was it implied that things were not created this way and stay that way forever, that things could change. Now, like I said, we're not surprised by the idea that things can change, you know, that an average dog can turn into an elite gazelle hunting dog. We're not surprised by that. But back then, that was pretty controversial because the people who didn't buy change, they believed things are created this way and they stay this way forever. And he said, hey, that may not be. The reason that riled so many people up wasn't religion, was politics. Okay? Let's face it. Back in the 1800s, there were the haves, and then there were the have-nots. More so than today, even. I know you hear a lot about the 1%. No. There were people with lousy life, and there were people with the good life. It's just the way it was. And people with the good life really didn't want to have all the other people hearing that change is possible. You weren't just created to be this way, and you'll be that way, and your kid will be that way, and your kid will be that way, and his kid will be that way. They didn't want to hear you could change. They didn't want people to hear that. So any talk about species changing, especially species changing naturally, without some God coming and changing it for them to raise something up, that really upset people. In fact, that was one of the things that Darwin was worried about, because he knew that a lot of his friends, a lot of his family was pretty upper crust. They didn't want to stir things up. They didn't want to be identified with those anarchists and those rabble-rousers who were saying, oh, things change, society is going to change, when he started to say, oh, animals will change. So he's like, oh, before we do this, I better have a lot of evidence. So he took notes. For 20 flipping years. Okay. So we'll get back to Darwin and his 20 years of pigeons, though. Let's talk about Victorian hobbies. Well, I guess we're talking about his 20 years of pigeons. One of the big hobbies back in the day was selective breeding. It was I will make the best breed of this, whatever it is. If you didn't have much money, you'd probably breed roses and violets in your flower bed. And oh, look, I'm trying to create the perfect rose. That was something people did. If you had a little more money, you had a little more space, you might have some dog kennels, and you would try to breed the perfect whatever dog. We already went through the list of ways dogs have been changed. If you had watched the whole video that I pulled the clip from with the foxes, what it says in the entire thing, it says most of the breeds that exist now didn't even exist 200 years ago. They were created in the last 200 years. And this is why. It was a very popular hobby to breed animals. If you were the really rich man, someone in Darwin's family status, what would you do? You'd pay your men, your field hands, to breed the cattle so you could create the ultimate cattle. You know, kind of like Eduardo Kaki pays someone to do something with biotech, like put jellyfish genes in a bunny rabbit. I have created. No, you haven't. Same thing, right? Right? Okay. But it was selective breeding. Selective breeding, it was well known. Artificial selection, it was well known. Darwin didn't say, wow, we can selectively breed stuff. Everybody knew that. Darwin said, hey, you know that selective breeding thing that we've been doing? That happens in nature too. That's what he did. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about the books that people were talking about at the time. Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. It was written in the 1830s. When Darwin went on the boat, the Beagle, on his big voyage to go to the islands and everything, he took a copy of the first volume with him. 2 and 3 hadn't been published yet, but he took a copy of the first one with him, and he read it, and he became friends with Lyell when he got back from his voyage. And they're like, because they're both upper class and all. But he became friends with Lyell. What Lyell's book said, Lyell's book was about geology. It wasn't about biology. But he said, hey, the Earth now is not the way the Earth was. And it has changed gradually over time. So the idea that big changes could happen over small time, that's something that Lyell was putting out there. And then other people like Darwin were aware of it. And everybody else was aware of it too, because this was a book that everybody was reading. Everybody was reading, everybody was talking about it. Even if you hadn't read it, you were aware of it. I'll give you a good example. Hey, there's this book that I've never read. But it's about sort of like this medieval time of magic, and there's this chick with blonde hair who has 3 dragons, and what am I talking about?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones. I've never read it, I've never watched it. But I know a little bit about it because I have friends who do. Okay? Okay, I'll give you another example. This was a few years older. There's this book about this bored housewife, and she hooks up with this guy who introduces her a whole wacky lifestyle of BDSM. And what book am I talking about? 50 Shades of Grey. Guess what? I never read that either. But you know about it whether you've read it or not, because everybody's talking about it in society. Am I right? Am I right? What?
She wasn't a housewife.
Oh, well, thank you. I hadn't read it.
I read that.
Okay, well, I hadn't read it, but thank you. The correction. I'll just say this woman. Okay, good, good. Anyway, I didn't know she was single, sorry. Anyway, so just like we in our culture, people talk about stuff, everybody knows about it, whether you've read it or not, kind of knows about it. Obviously, you can get some details wrong, like I did. But people talked about it. People talked about Lyell's principles of geology. The idea that, hey, things do not stay the way they are created. Things have changed. And then, I will not even try to pronounce the French dude's name. There was a French guy who wrote about plants. He wrote about plants, and he wrote down that plants were competing with each other. You'll see that in lab. We're going to be talking about how plants compete for light, plants compete for nutrients in the soil, plants compete for water. That's what we're going to be talking about today. But plants competing with each other. And he even had this phrase, of course it was in French, but translated in English is nature's war. Okay? He wrote this in the 20s. So the idea that things change, the idea that organisms are fighting with each other, competing with each other. And then there was Malthus. He was an economist. Well, he was a pastor who dabbled in economics. But he was an economist, and he wrote this essay on population. And back in the days, remember I said life really sucked back then if you didn't have a lot of money? There was no minimum wage. And so Malthus was saying, you know, this is going to be even worse as the human population grows more, because you'll have people competing. Well, I need a job. I got to feed my family. I'll work for less than him. And then this guy's like, I'll work for less than either of them. And this guy's like, I'll work for less than. And it would drive wages down to nothing. And then everybody would starve because you may have a full-time job, but you don't have the money to feed your family. Does this sound familiar? It was even worse back then. So competition, the human population could grow beyond the available resources, and then you have competition. That was an idea that was out there. Darwin had a copy of Malthus's essay with him on the boat when he was traveling. He was reading it. All right. Chambers. We already talked about this book that he published anonymously in 1844. He took what had been a fringe view, species of change, and he put that front and center. Now Darwin already was thinking that, and he's like, yeah. And after the fact, after he wrote the big book, after the 3rd edition of the big book, Darwin actually said, yeah, Chambers' book, it called attention to the subject, removed prejudice against the idea, prepared the groundwork for people to be receptive to his ideas. Wallace was younger. Wallace got his idea that species change from reading Chambers' book. But Wallace had read all of these things just like Darwin had read all of these things. Most people in society were either reading this stuff or discussing it. They might be for it, they might be against it, but those ideas were out there. Good? All right. So, early ideas about change in species existed, but they had the wrong mechanism. Darwin was aware of those ideas, and then he got on a boat as a naturalist in 1831. And they traveled all over the place from Europe and down and over and come back. But the fun part was here in the Galapagos Islands. That was the shaping thing for Darwin. And it's interesting because Wallace did the same thing. He went to islands. In fact, I'm going to show you a movie about it.
Evolution1 natural selection.
So here's the deal. If you look at what happened, Darwin went on the boat. He went to the islands, the Galapagos Islands. When Darwin gets to the Galapagos, he sees all these different species. Every island has different species. And he's the finches that he's the most famous for, he didn't even notice it there. He collected them, and then some other guy, when he's having him stuff his animals, the guy said, you know, these are different species. Like, huh? Anyway, but Darwin in the 1830s came up with the idea of natural selection as a way of causing species to change. That was his thing. And he also said, hey, this is really going to upset people, talking about changes in the natural order. I don't want my family name drugged through the dirt. No. If I'm going to say this, I better have evidence. So he starts raising pigeons, hanging out with people who raise pigeons, because they're developing breeds through artificial selection. He talks to people who breed dogs. He spends a little over 20 years writing down every bit of evidence that he can. Like, this could be evidence for this idea, this could be evidence for this idea. He had 250 pages of stuff he had written notes that could support this. And all of a sudden, he gets this paper, this letter from the Malay Archipelago, Indonesia area. But of course, back then it took a year to send a letter. And it's from this guy. He knew him. He'd met him once or twice, and he'd even bought a few birds from the guy. Sent me some stuffed birds that are unique there. You know, he wanted to use them for his research on natural selection. And they'd actually swapped letters a few times in there where Wallace had said something about species changing, and Darwin said, yeah, I think, and he wrote back and said, yeah, I think they do. I've got some ideas about that. I'll have a book coming out eventually. That's all he said. Wallace writes down, remember, Darwin has 250 pages of evidence, and he's not going to publish yet because he wants a lot of evidence so everybody knows that he's not just talking, right? Wallace is a little different. He's younger, he's hungrier, he's not from the upper crust, he's socially climbing. He's trying to get recognized as a scientist who knows something, even though he didn't have as good of an education, as good of a background. Came up with all the same ideas. He wrote them down in 20 pages. Not with a lot of evidence, because he didn't have it. He had evidence, but not like Darwin. And he sends off the 20 pages. And Darwin's like, oh, crud. The last 20 years of my work is useless. You know, I'm about to get scooped. And, I mean, to his credit, Darwin could have been like, yeah, nobody's ever heard of him, and thrown the letter away. The letter came with a cover letter that said, hey, Mr. Darwin, you're this famous biologist. If you think that your friend Lyle, if you think this is worthy, will you let Lyle see it? Darwin shows Lyle, and Darwin says, my God, it's like he's been reading my book. You heard the quote. You know, it's like he's using my chapter headings as his opening sentences on each paragraph. All the same stuff. And he actually got really depressed. Like, oh my word, I'm going to be scooped. And it was Lyle and I think Huxley. But anyway, definitely Lyle. But it was his friends who said, you had the idea first. We know this. You've talked to us privately about it. You wouldn't publish because you were chicken. Well, so I said, because you needed evidence, yeah. But so we know you had the idea first. How about if you present them together? That was Lyell's idea. And so they did. They did. That's what they did, because they didn't want Darwin to be completely scooped and his decades of work to be useless. So they presented both. And then after the little paper and the little paper, Darwin, his friends were like, now write the book. And so over the next year, Darwin took the 250 pages of notes and turned it into the big fat book. And that's the origin. Does that make sense? Good? All right, so here's Wallace. Wallace in 1848, he went to Brazil with Bates. Yes, that's Bates, like Batesian mimicry that we're going to talk about, how animals that are dangerous have ones that are not dangerous that look like them, bluffing. That was Bates' idea. He came up with that. And then after you heard how that happened, all his live animals and his dead animals, they all died. I said they all burned up. And he really wanted to go back with a live toucan and everything. When he went there, I just got done reading his book about the Malay Archipelago, the trip. And it was awful reading because at one point he had an orphan orangutan and he was trying to nurse it, but they didn't have any goats to get milk, and so he was trying to make a gruel out of ground up plant roots, and so trying to keep it alive because he wanted to take a live orangutan back to Europe because it would nobody had seen a live orangutan, you know. And he talked about how it got weaker and weaker and died. That chapter is really sad. And the same thing happened when he had these fabulous birds of paradise with the big tails. He had some of the people who were working for him build these cages out of bamboo that he could try to keep the birds alive. And the problem was that he found this out later. The way that people were capturing them was they go up to a tree with arrows that were blunt tip. And they boom and stun the bird and knock it down, but of course that breaks bones and they have internal bleeding and everything. So every time he tried to keep a bird alive, you know, he was paying people to bring him live birds. Now they died after about 3 days, you know. But he was collecting all kinds of things that were dead, all kinds of things that were alive, more dead than alive, obviously. But he was trying to bring things back, and he kept getting sick. He kept getting bit by mosquitoes, getting malaria, and oh my God. And while he was there, he read all the same kinds of books, you know, because he brought books with him. And so, if you think about it, he came up with the exact same idea as Darwin. That's why I said earlier, it doesn't matter what Darwin said, because somebody else would have figured it out. Darwin's not important, it's his idea that's important. And his idea was not evolution, his idea was how evolution can happen. Other people have been talking about evolution. It was how it happens, and his idea was natural selection. But Wallace had the exact same idea. So the idea was already out there that the earth was old and it was changing. The idea was already out there that species change. The idea was already out there that not everything's going to survive and that there's competition among organisms. The only thing they did was they both connected the dots and said, hey, that's why animals are changing too. That's what they came up with. Are you good? You good? Or if you want to say it in a fancier way, they both figured out that differential reproductive success can change a species. Good? So Darwin and Wallace, they have similar background. They both traveled to islands, new island chain. They both saw new species. They both saw that their species would be similar from island to island, but only found on that island. And they both saw that all these similar, closely related species on these islands, the closest thing they were related to, other than each other, was one on the mainland. Kind of like some of the birds are trying to fly and they get caught in a storm and get blown over the islands and they spread over the islands and they differ, slightly different conditions, they all changed. All right? So they all said, hey, they both said, hey, these could have descended from one older species that's on the mainland. Their new idea is what we call natural selection. It's selection that happens in the wild. This is a very different mechanism than what Lamarck said. Okay? Very different mechanism. We now use the E word, the scary evolution word, for what they used to call descent with modification. Their breakthrough was not there is descent with modification. Their breakthrough was this is how it happens. Good? If you get nothing else in this class, I want you to know that natural selection was the breakthrough. Natural selection was the new idea. It wasn't evolution. That's okay. I've been bitten. Ow, he has teeth. Ow, ow, ow.